Hello, I'm Topher. Did you know that The Guardian, that newspaper outlet that ever so happily repeated government claims here in Australia that anti-lockdown protests were neo-Nazis and wanted your grandmother to die, are now in favour of anti-lockdown protests? I know, it's amazing, it's so good. But there is a catch. You see, they're in favour of the anti-lockdown protests that are happening in China. Of course they are. China has seen a wave of what were at first barely reported anti-lockdown protests that were absolutely kicked into high gear. They were already happening, but they kicked into high gear a few days ago when there was a building fire in which a number of people died. There are suggestions and questions that the death toll was increased by COVID infection control policies that potentially stopped residents of that building and maybe even some firefighters from exiting that building when they could have. Now that, of course, has kicked things into high gear, and we've seen the protests increase and spread since then. But they've been going on for quite some time, and the media really didn't seem to pay attention. Well, they're paying attention now, and this is where the fun really begins. Because we've seen reports emerging in the last few days, and late to the party Guardian is actually liking what it sees. They've just published an article that says, "People want to live." That's a sympathetic headline if ever I saw one, and certainly a stark contrast to what they had to say about anti-lockdown protesters here in Australia, in Sydney and especially in Melbourne, where we were being labelled all kinds of things and certainly nothing with sympathy. The Guardian goes on to write a puff piece quoting multiple different Chinese residents, saying things like, "The zero COVID policy cannot go on." Well, I agree. I was saying that while we had the COVID zero policy here in Victoria, and the Guardian didn't have anything nice to say about me or the many thousands and at times tens of thousands of my fellow Victorians who joined me on the streets to make exactly that point. But they can find it in their hearts now to make sympathetic coverage of these Chinese protesters who are saying exactly the same thing. Today's video was brought to you by Brew Australia. This is actually my own coffee company. The coffee is roasted, ground and packaged here in Australia by a very dear friend of mine who is also the most amazing coffee snob you've ever met. The coffee tastes fantastic. It's got numerous 5-star reviews. It's available right now from brewaustralia.com, and every single purchase helps me to be able to keep doing what I do. The Sydney Morning Herald, for their part, are managing to maintain their dignity that little bit more by not really coming out in support of the protests, but they are reporting on what's happening, and their words sound eerily familiar to those of us that were on the streets of Melbourne. I'll read from this article that says, "A massive show of force by China's police for anti-lockdown protesters, silence from Xi Jinping." Scroll down a little bit, you'll discover that hundreds of SUVs, vans and armoured vehicles with flashing lights were parked on city streets, while police and paramilitary forces conducted random ID checks and searched people's mobile phones for photos, banned apps or other potential evidence that they had taken part in demonstrations. Well, here in Melbourne, of course, we certainly had the vehicles. We even had 1 or 2 armoured vehicles. We certainly had paramilitary forces on the streets conducting ID checks, beating people up and then conducting ID checks, and they were checking coffee cups to make sure that you actually had coffee in them. Further into the article, we discover most protesters focused their ire on the zero COVID policy that has placed millions under lockdown and quarantine, limiting their access to food and medicine while ravaging the economy and severely restricting travel. Now, it is true that what the Chinese government has done is next level. They've genuinely been barricading people into their apartment buildings and even into their apartments. That never happened in Melbourne that much. Well, actually it did, didn't it? It happened in Kensington, where they shut down apartment buildings, limiting people's access to food. They survived on nuts, according to a human rights abuse claim, and limiting their access to medicine. Some people don't have 5, 6, 7, 8 days worth of medicine sitting in their cabinet, particularly if you're living in low-income housing like those towers were. So actually, yeah, we did that too. Not as widespread, granted, but we did the same thing. The article goes on to say that many mocked the government's ever-changing line of reasoning. Sound familiar? As well as claims that hostile outside foreign forces were stirring the wave of anger. You remember John Setka and you remember Daniel Andrews getting on television saying that, those tradie protesters, well, maybe some of them were tradies, but most of them weren't. They were just there for a fight. This idea that there's external outside forces coming in and sabotaging the movement, because there couldn't possibly be a genuine grassroots groundswell of anger at having your lives destroyed by lockdown policies. Notice the difference in tone between how the Guardian are reporting what the Chinese people are doing versus how they reported what we did here in Melbourne. Notice the same from the Sydney Morning Herald. They're being more careful, but their tone is still decidedly different to how they reported on the protests in Sydney and in Melbourne. Amazing, isn't it? And yet they'll get away with it. Most people, they won't know, they won't notice. I want to finish with Justin Trudeau, who is, of course, the Canadian Prime Minister, responsible for kicking the trucker protest out of the capital of Canada and cracking down on the human rights of his own citizens in ways that have never been seen before. He recently, laughably, came out in support of the Chinese anti-lockdown protests. I'm not making this up. What he said was, everyone in China should be allowed to express themselves, and will stand with people who are expressing themselves. This is from Justin Trudeau. This is from emergency powers, send in the cops, arrest people, steal money from their bank accounts, shut them down online, call them every name under the sun to the national media, Justin Trudeau. He now is coming out in support of Chinese anti-lockdown protests. Now, the hypocrisy, of course, is rank and blatantly obvious to all, but don't you worry, the media's got Justin Trudeau's back. Here's an article from the National Post, headlined, "Is Trudeau a giant hypocrite for supporting China's anti-lockdown protests?" First reading, yes, Trudeau crushed Canada's own anti-lockdown protests, but China's are on a slightly different level. Oh, wait for the nuance here. We're going to nuance our way through this to discover that actually Justin Trudeau is right after all. We scroll down a little bit, and they acknowledge this week Prime Minister Justin Trudeau wholeheartedly endorsed a wave of disruptive anti-lockdown protests currently roiling the People's Republic of China. Everyone in China should be allowed to express themselves, he said. We'll stand with people who are expressing themselves. They go on to say, now this is no longer a quote, this is their opinion. It is the job of any Canadian leader to support dissident movements in communist China, but the sentiment quickly inspired eye rolls among the world's more anti-Trudeau quarters. Maybe pro-freedom would have been a better way to describe those quarters. To many observers, both foreign and domestic, one of Trudeau's signature actions as Prime Minister was the suspension of Canada's usual safeguards on civil liberties in order to evict an anti-mandate protest in the nation's capital. What a mild way to put it when you're shutting down people's bank accounts, arresting people. It's the language they use is so manipulative. But they get to the point. Is Trudeau a hypocrite for supporting Chinese protesters whilst crushing those at home? We'll let you decide. No, they won't. They'll tell you what to think. Because they go on to say the Chinese government is unelected. That's important. Oh, you have to take that into account. You see, it's okay when an elected government tramples human rights. That's completely fine. That's what they're saying here. They're saying the difference here, the reason why the anti-lockdown protests in China are a good thing is because they're not a democratic government. It wasn't a democratic government that took away people's human rights. If your human rights can be taken away just because other people, the people around you like it, like the government that's doing it, then you don't have human rights. What the National Post are saying here in this headline article is, we don't understand what human rights are. That's what they're saying. The sad thing is a lot of people are going to read this and just completely buy it, take it all, hook, line, and sinker. It is utterly absurd to think that we've got to the point now where the media are tying themselves in knots as they try and maintain their always manipulative, pretzel-like logic around their support for the lockdowns, the mandates, all of the various COVID measures and the human rights abuses that came with them here in Australia, and their hatred of the anti-lockdown protesters like myself, and yet they try and come out in support of the same protests happening in China. And they try now to justify Justin Trudeau supporting one whilst cracking down on the other. All you can do is laugh, but it also highlights a very, very serious problem, and one that I plan to address as much as I can next year. And that is that these people who talk about human rights and talk about freedom and talk about these things, they don't actually understand what those words mean. The word freedom is used by everyone all the time. We're a free country. Okay, but do you understand freedom the same way that I do? When we talk about freedom, are we talking about the same thing or are we not? What is a human right? Is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the UN, is that it? Is that correct? Is everything in there something that should be in there? Or maybe different people are working to different definitions of what human rights are. And maybe we need to talk about this, because maybe part of the reason why human rights and freedoms are being trampled all over the world is because actually none of us really understands exactly what it is that we're talking about when we talk about freedom and we talk about human rights. And that's a project that I've got underway. I'll be launching that early in 2023, a series of videos simply working through the very simple questions and the very simple logical chains, the logical sequences that can lead us from simple questions to basic fundamental conclusions that can help us to understand when we talk about freedom, when we talk about human rights, what are we talking about? What is this? So I'd encourage you, if you haven't already, to like and subscribe, follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and a bunch of others as well. go to my website, topherfield.net, and please make sure you've signed up to be on the email list. This is the only reliable way that I have of communicating with you if I do get deplatformed at some point in time. So that's topherfield.net. Make sure you've signed up. Thank you so very much for watching and for your support. I'll see you in the next video.